Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and this will be a reading of The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James, Chapter 1, John Stuart Mill and the Utility of Religion, Part 1, Introduction. So, Chapter 1, John Stuart Mill and Utility of Religion, Part 1, Introduction. I begin my analysis of the utility of religion with an examination of John Stuart Mill's Utility of Religion, which is arguably one of the most significant contributions made to the subject, despite its short length of less than 30 pages. Compare this with William James's masterpiece, The Varieties of Religious Experience, a canonical work in the philosophy of religion and the subject of Chapter 3, which, in addition to being much more widely known, weighs in at over 500 pages. What Mill, a 19th century British philosopher, is able to do in this essay is quite extraordinary. The Utility of Religion and two other essays written by Mill, Nature and Theism, were collectively published posthumously in 1874 as three essays on religion. Despite its brevity, Mill advances a surprising number of arguments in Utility of Religion. Before turning to Mill's analysis, I'd like to make a few brief prefatory remarks to help establish some context for his essay. Utility of Religion seems like an excellent place to start because, as the title of the essay suggests, it is expressly concerned with considerations of the usefulness of religion. Consider Mill's stated purpose in writing the essay. Quote, "It is perfectly conceivable that religion may be morally useful without being intellectually sustainable, and it would be a proof of great prejudice in any unbeliever to deny that there have been ages and that there are still both nations and individuals with regard to whom this is actually the case, whether it is the case generally and with reference to the future. It is the object of this paper to examine." Footnote 8 cites the source. Here, Mill calls attention to the distinction between the utility and the truth of religion. Indeed, Mill, who was known for championing utilitarianism, makes frequent appeals to the notion of utility, and perhaps more importantly, to its significance throughout many of his writings, just as he does in his essay Nature, where he says, quote, "All human action whatsoever consists in altering, and all useful action in improving, the spontaneous course of nature," end quote. Footnote 9 cites the source. It is not surprising, then, that Mill's focus in the utility of religion is not on the truth of various religious doctrines, but on whether religions ultimately aid us in the pursuit of a good life. At the time he penned Utility of Religion, Mill believed it was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain religion intellectually. Although Mill was always committed, first and foremost, to a value system governed primarily by considerations of utility and progress, as opposed to considerations of truth, he never completely severed the connection between them, and he explicitly remarks on the importance of this connection. For example, he begins Utility of Religion by suggesting that, quote, "If religion or any particular form of it is true, its usefulness follows without other proof," end quote. Footnote 10 cites the source. For Mill, the relationship between truth and utility is an important one, and this relationship is often, as it is here, at the crux of discussions regarding both the truth and the usefulness of religion. I will address this relationship in more detail in section C of part 3, as well as in subsequent chapters, but here I limit my reflections regarding this relationship to one more point. It is worth emphasizing that Mill is leery of those who are quick to dismiss the usefulness of religion simply on the grounds that its teachings are not true. He believes this dismissive standpoint is unwarranted, and he does not share the assumption of the skeptical philosophers, whom he suggest that, quote, "If religion be false, nothing but good can be the consequence of rejecting it," end quote. And that's footnote 11 cites the source. In fact, he fears there are some who take their misgivings regarding the intellectual sustainability of religion too far and overstate the case against religion, as is evident from the declaration of his purpose in writing the essay. Accordingly, Robert Carr, who traces the evolution of Mill's thoughts on religion throughout Mill's lifetime in his article, "The Religious Thought of John Stuart Mill, a Study in Reluctant Skepticism," is right to suggest that, quote, "For Mill, the problem of the utility of religion could not be so simply disposed of as skeptical philosophers were wont to believe," end quote. Footnote 12 cites the source. Footnote 13. Carr provides a fascinating account of the evolution of Mill's view on religion. Carr argues that these views changed considerably throughout Mill's life, suggesting, for example, that, quote, The Mill of 1870 was quite far removed, intellectually as well as chronologically, from the youthful propagandist who in 1823 had campaigned almost flippantly for religious toleration. Carr, in turn, attributes this significant shift in views to three factors. Quote, Mill's personality itself, his absorbing concern for morality, and the age in which he lived, end quote. With respect to this last factor, Carr remarks that, quote, perhaps Mill unknowingly described himself as well as his age when in On Liberty he characterized Victorian England as an, quote, age devoid of faith yet terrified of skepticism, end quote. And all the quotations within that footnote are also cited in that footnote. Again, that was footnote 13. Not surprisingly, Mill spends considerable time at the beginning of the essay trying to show how some have taken these anti-religious sentiments too far. Mill claims, for example, that Jeremy Bentham, a good friend of Mill's father and a significant influence on Mill himself, overstated the skeptical case, and that Bentham's discussion presses many parts of the argument too hard, end quote. Footnote 14 cites the source. Mill also suggests that these skeptics need to proceed more cautiously and exhibit more tolerance when considering the possibility of moral benefits pertaining to religion. He suggests that, for the sake of argument, we ought to suppose that religion embodies the best moral perspective available, and then to ask whether religion is necessary or optimal for it, which the skeptical philosophers whom he references are reluctant and or fail to do. Finally, although he will ultimately argue against many of the arguments in favor of the utility of religion, he insists that most of the ill effects of religion ought to be divorced from it, claiming that as humankind evolves and progresses, quote, the immoral or otherwise mischievous consequences which have been drawn from religion are one by one abandoned, and after having been long fought for as of its very essence, are discovered to be easily separable from it, end quote. Footnote 15 cites the source. Footnote 16. I expressed my worries about this claim in section C of part 2. End of footnote 16. In sum, while Mill does not ultimately evince a very favorable impression of the usefulness of religion, especially as we shall see with respect to its social utility, he certainly remains on guard against any unwarranted hostility towards such prospects. Lastly, I ought to say something about what Mill means by religion, a term that has been notoriously difficult to define. I think Daniel Dennett, a contemporary thinker closely associated with the new atheism movement, is right when he says, quote, we should expect and tolerate some difficulty in arriving at a counterexample proof definition of something as diverse and complex as religion, end quote. Footnote 17 cites the source. In his own utilitarian analysis of religion, Mill suggests that, quote, the essence of religion is the strong and earnest direction of the emotions and desires towards an ideal object, recognized as of the highest excellence, and is rightfully paramount over all selfish objects of desire, end quote. Footnote 18 cites the source. For Mill, as Lou Matz points out, quote, what makes these ideals religious is that they are the ultimate concern of human beings and form the highest ends to which all others are secondary, end quote. Footnote 19 cites the source. In my view, this kind of definition can be problematic because it defines religion in such a broad manner that it includes secular commitments such as patriotism, as we shall see in outlining Mill's analysis, and Marxism, and even Mill's own commitment to utilitarianism, commitments that I believe most people would not readily associate with religion. Footnote 20. I do not mean to suggest that Mill is alone in thinking of religion in such a general fashion. For example, in his book Psychoanalysis and Religion, Erich Fromm offers a similar notion of religious experience, saying, quote, religious experience is the wondering, the marveling, the becoming aware of life and of one's own existence, and of the puzzling problem of one's relatedness to the world, end quote. Fromm also maintains that a feeling of oneness, akin to the famous oceanic feeling Freud alludes to in his Civilization and its Discontents, is an element of the religious experience. Additionally, James employs a very similar conception of religion, as will become clear in chapter 3. End of footnote 20. Furthermore, it seems strange, given the undertones of Mill's own writings, to think of him as religious, yet his conception of religion would oblige us to do so. It seems to me that, when thinking of religion, most people have something more specific in mind than what Mill offers us here. In defining religion, most would likely appeal to some notion of God, and perhaps to other supernatural phenomena. World religions such as Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Hinduism, in addition to various indigenous religions, make this kind of appeal. Accordingly, what most people likely have in mind is not just any ideal object, as Mill's general characterization suggests, but something more specific and akin to Dennett's conception of religions, which he describes as, quote, social systems whose participants avow belief in a supernatural agent or agents whose approval is to be sought, end quote. Footnote 21 cites the source. Yet, and I cannot emphasize the following point enough, while Mill thinks of religion in such a broad manner, most of his analysis in utility of religion actually focuses on a more particular kind of religion, to wit, what he calls supernatural religions, by which he means something that closely resembles Dennett's definition of the term after all. Footnote 22. The difficulties associated with defining religion is a recurring theme throughout the remainder of the dissertation. End of footnote 22. In my estimation, Mill concisely and for the most part judiciously attempts to analyze religion in terms of its effects on society and on individuals. Mill suggests that, quote, the inquiry divides itself into two parts, corresponding to the double aspect of the subject, its social and its individual aspect. What does religion do for society, and what for the individual? End quote. Footnote 23 cites the source. In outlining his views regarding the matter, I follow this general structure, beginning with an analysis of what he has to say regarding religion as an instrument of social good, part 2, and then moving on to a discussion of his thoughts regarding religion as an instrument of individual good, part 3. I will survey the many arguments he presents regarding the relationship between religion and morality, and discuss his well-known substitute for supernatural religions, the religion of humanity. I will argue that, with a few exceptions, which I will expand on as they appear, he generally offers illuminating observations with respect to both social and the individual utility of religion. I will also express a few concerns, however, which ultimately make Mill's analysis seem somewhat incomplete. I will soon turn to an analysis of why it is that Mill thinks religion erroneously receives so much credit for society's moral persuasions, section B of part 2, which will be followed by an analysis of why he thinks religion is in many ways morally problematic, section C of part 2. But first, I shall begin by characterizing the thesis that religion is morally advantageous. So that again was part 1, Introduction to Chapter 1, John Stuart Mill and Utility of Religion. And again, this is from The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James.